What if dragons were not invented from nothing, but were built from real bones, real animals, and real reports that ancient people did not yet have the science to explain? Around 450 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about winged serpents connected with Arabia and Egypt. He claimed that these creatures flew from Arabia toward Egypt, and that ibises stopped them at a narrow pass, where he also described seeing scattered bones and spines. To a modern reader, this is not proof that dragons existed, but it is proof of something almost as interesting. More than 2,000 years ago, one of history's most famous writers was already preserving reports of snake-like creatures with wings. Centuries later, in the late 1200s, Marco Polo traveled through Asia and later described huge serpents in the regions he visited. These creatures had powerful bodies, terrifying jaws, and body parts valued for medicine. Modern explanations usually point to crocodiles, giant snakes, or local animals described through the language of dragons, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Again and again, travelers entered unfamiliar regions, heard stories of giant reptiles, saw animals they did not fully understand, and recorded them in ways that later readers connected with dragons. Even earlier, after Alexander the Great's campaigns in India around 326 BC, later ancient writers repeated stories of enormous serpents feared by local people. These accounts are difficult to verify, and we should not treat them as direct eyewitness proof, but they show how the ancient world connected distant lands with giant reptile-like creatures, especially in places where Greeks and Europeans expected nature to be stranger, larger, and more dangerous. The strongest historical clue, however, may not be an animal at all, but bones. For centuries in China, large fossil bones were called dragon bones, and they were collected, traded, and used in traditional medicine long before modern paleontology existed. By the 1800s and early 1900s, scientists began realizing that many of these so-called dragon bones were actually fossils from extinct animals, including ancient horses, rhinos, deer, elephants, and other prehistoric mammals. Imagine finding a huge tooth, a massive skull, or a strange spine buried in a hillside in a time before dinosaurs, extinction, or evolution were understood. If no living animal matched what you found, dragon was not fantasy, it was an explanation. This is why dragon legends may be more historical than they first appear. A crocodile seen by someone who had never encountered one could become a river dragon. A giant python could become a cave monster. A fossil skull could become the head of an ancient beast. And each retelling could add wings, fire, treasure, and fear. The gorilla gives us a useful comparison. For centuries, stories of huge human-like apes in Africa sounded unbelievable to many outsiders, until the gorilla was scientifically described in 1847. The giant squid followed a similar path, moving from sea monster legend to biological reality once physical evidence became undeniable. These examples do not prove dragons were real, but they remind us that some legends begin when people encounter something real before science is ready to name it. So maybe dragons were never one single creature. Maybe they were a historical shadow made from many things at once. Fossil bones, crocodiles, snakes, monitor lizards, traveler reports, local myths, medicine, fear, and the human instinct to turn danger into symbol. There were also real animals that could easily feed the dragon image. The Komodo dragon, scientifically described in 1912, is the largest living lizard in the world. a venomous predator with a heavy body, sharp claws, a forked tongue, and a slow, ancient-looking movement that already feels almost mythological. To someone hearing exaggerated reports from distant islands, an animal like this could easily become a land dragon. Giant snakes may have played the same role. The reticulated python of Southeast Asia is one of the longest snakes on Earth, with confirmed individuals reaching extraordinary lengths, while large crocodiles can look like armored river monsters when seen from the water's edge. A traveler who saw a crocodile only briefly, or heard its size repeated through several languages, might not describe a reptile in modern zoological terms. He might describe a dragon. Even flying dragons may have had a scientific shadow behind them, because long before people understood pterosaurs, fossils of winged reptiles could suggest that gigantic flying creatures once existed. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, but they were real flying reptiles, and some had long skulls, sharp teeth, and wingspans large enough to look impossible to anyone who found their bones without scientific context. So when ancient people spoke of dragons, they may have been combining several real things into one impossible creature. The body of a snake, the jaws of a crocodile, the claws of a monitor lizard, the wings imagined from strange fossils, and the terror of animals that live beyond the edge of familiar maps. In that sense, dragons were not simply invented, they were assembled. They were built from the most frightening pieces of the natural world, then enlarged by distance, rumor, memory, and fear. Around 450 BC, Herodotus preserved stories of winged serpents. Around 326 BC, Alexander's campaigns helped spread tales of enormous Indian snakes. In the late 1200s, Marco Polo recorded huge reptiles in Asia. In China, dragon bones preserved the remains of prehistoric animals for centuries before science could identify them. And in 1847, the gorilla reminded the modern world that some unbelievable animal stories are not always pure fantasy. So the real question is not whether dragons existed exactly as legends describe them, because they almost certainly did not. The better question is this: what did ancient people see, find, and fear that made dragons feel so real for so long? Because sometimes mythology is not the opposite of truth. Sometimes mythology is what happens when truth is discovered too early, before science has a name for it. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please subscribe, like the video, and join us in the next episode.